Hello, I'm Dr. Ola Camera Designer. Welcome to Discrete Event Simulation. This is Lecture 14, Modeling Detailed Operations in Arena. I will talk about lower level modeling, also three-way decisions, variables, expressions, and storages. We will also discuss blocks panel and logical or fake entities. So today we will learn how to build model 5.1 from the book, which models simple call center. We will discuss lower level modeling, including additional modules from advanced process panel, multi-way decisions, variable expressions and storages. We'll talk about blocks panel, terminating versus steady state operation, and logical or fake entities, terminating condition, using the terminating condition in run setup in Arena. So let's talk about the setup of model 5.1. We have one phone number for customers to call into, 26 trunk lines, one needed for each call, incoming or outgoing, talking or on hold. Arriving call, finding no free trunk lines, gets busy signal and goes away. Count number of such rejected calls will also be introduced in the model. The calls will arrive with inter-arrival time exponential 0.857 minutes. And the first call will arrive at time 0. There will be 3 incoming call types. And we'll have initial recording to decide which call type your call is going to be, and the time to decide is uniformly distributed between 0.1 and 0.6 minutes. And the 3 different call types are tech support, sales, and order status. We have 76% tech support calls, 16% sales calls, and 8% order status calls. So regarding the tech support calls, there will be 3 different product types, product type 1, product type 2, and product type 3. For the first type, we have 25 of all tech support calls being product type 1, 34 of all tech support calls being type 2, and 41 of type 3. So we again will have a recording to select which product type it is, and that's uniformly distributed with time between 0.1 and 0.5. And each tech support call will need qualified tech support person, and we'll have different tech support people. There's 2 tech support people for type 1, 3 for type 2, and 3 for type 3 available, and no crossover to another type, but will allows us in model 5.2. We'll also have separate first in, first out, or FIFO, queues for each type. We'll have a conversation time delay, triangular, with parameters 3, 6, and 18 minutes for all types. And after the tech support call is done, then it leaves the system. Regarding the sales calls, we have all the same. We have 4 sales staff available, again all the same. 1 first in, first out queue, feeding all sales staff. Conversation time is triangular with parameter 4, 15, and 45. And at the end, the sales call leaves the system. We also will have order status calls, again all the same type, handled automatically by phone system. No limit on number in process at a time except for trunk line limit. And we'll have conversation time, and again conversation is in quotation marks, triangularly distributed with parameters 2, 3, and 4. And after conversation, 15% of callers will opt to talk to a person. So they're routed to sales staff, and conversation lasts an additional triangularly distributed time with parameters 2, 3, and 4. And sales calls will have higher priority, so it's non-preemptive. So the setup for the call center is that the center will receive calls from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and we must terminate the arrival process exactly at 6 p.m. So even though we terminate arrival at 6 p.m., we don't close the center. It will operate past 6 p.m. if necessary to flush out all calls that were received before 6 p.m. We will also introduce several output performance measures, including number of calls that were attempted, rejected, and completed. And we'll have by call type, total time in the system, and by resource, time on hold, and number of calls on hold. We also will record statistics on resource utilization of personnel and trunk lines. We'll talk about terminating in steady state. So to decide whether the simulation is terminating or steady state, we need to consider the time frame of interest for each application. So in order to be able to distinguish between terminating and steady state, we need to think whether it falls into a category of terminating or steady state, again, based on our interest. So the terminating would be specific starting and stopping conditions. An example is this model 5.1. It has specific starting and stopping conditions. And some of our previous models that we considered were also terminating, if not all of them. And then the stopping condition could be of several forms: fixed time or count condition, as we will have here. The different kind of model is a steady state model. In that case, we're interested in trying to estimate a situation in which the simulation could run forever. Of course, technically we cannot run it forever, so we're trying to run a long-term simulation and just approximate the steady state. So in a steady state, the output performance measures are a limit assimilated at time that goes to infinity. And again, the choice between terminating or steady state usually depends on intent of a study and not on the model logic. So we also will use several new modeling panels in this model. So let's discuss the modeling panels that we have in Arena. So you're already very well familiar with the basic process panel. And that's the highest, fastest modeling level. Usually the place to start because it already has a lot of details included and assumed. The advanced process is the next level. It has smaller building elements, other functions, and allow for more detailed modeling. And then the next things that we also looked at is advanced transfer. So it's a different kind of model because it allows us to model in more detail entity movement and material handling. This model that we will talk about in this in this lecture will involve the blocks panel. So the blocks panel is also kind of similar in a way to elements panel, although they both have different modules that are in there in those panels. Those are lowest modeling level panels, and they're often based on Simon simulation language, and repeat some of the capabilities of higher level panels, but some functions available only here in the blocks or elements panels. And there are some other special purpose panels, and they're dependent on the type of the license that you have for Arena. Some of them are not available for student license. So we also will discuss for Model 5.1, we'll discuss that data structure. And that's very important when you model the logic to consider what type of data structure you need to use. So we will need to reuse the data in several places in this model. And so we'll define it once global for the whole model, redefine once modeling generality and user efficiency. So the data structures in Arena are the global variables and the global expressions. So Arena global variables can store numbers, but they cannot store formulas. They can be used to define the variables when we go into basic process, there's a variable data module, and that's where you define the variables in Arena. And these Arena variables can also change during the run. We can use a sign module to do it, but there's also other ways. And it could be all different type of variables that we can consider. We could consider a scalar variable, like just a single number, or we can have a matrix of numbers, right, or vector of numbers. So any of those possibilities are possible in Arena. And so another type of data structure that Arena has is expressions, global Arena expressions. And that's where we store formulas. As you remember, I mentioned when we talked about variables that variables can only store numbers, they cannot store formulas. Expressions can also store numbers, but they're typically used to store formulas. An important part to remember is if you do store numbers in expression, you cannot change them throughout the model, or later in the model as the model runs, you cannot change those. So that's very different from variables, because variables can change during the model run, but expressions cannot. So you can use mathematical operations, numbers or random variables, attributes or variables to create the expressions. And you define expression in the expression data module, and that's also it's in a different panel, because variables are in the basic process, but expressions are in advanced process. And expressions can also be just like variables. They can be scalar, a vector, or 1D array, or 2D array, or a matrix. So let's go ahead and start modeling, and we'll talk first about the arrivals. We're going to create attempted calls. We'll have entity type called incoming call, and that will change later. We'll have maximum arrivals, which is going to be a variable, and we initialize it to 999,999. So that's going to be, again, a variable that we will use in our create module. And at 6 p.m., which is time 600 minutes, we change this variable to 1 to stop the arrivals. We'll discuss this more in details later in the model. And the entities per arrival, entities per arrival will be calls per arrival, which is also going to be the variable, and it will be initialized to 1. So let's see. We also will change this at 6 p.m. or 600 minutes. We'll change this to 0 to kill arrivals, and we'll discuss it more later in this model. So let's go ahead and start modeling. Let me open the Arena and begin modeling. So here you can see me in Arena. I opened Arena and I'm saving. I already pressed New button here, or you can go File, New, or press this button, and that opens a empty model for me. And the next thing I'm doing is I'm saving this model as model 5.1 from the book in my models folder. And so now I can begin modeling. So as I mentioned, we're going to be using 2 variables. So I'm going to go ahead and go to basic process where the variable data module is located. So here, right, the modules above are flowchart modules. The modules below are data modules. So here's my variable module. So I'm going to go ahead and create variable here. So right now there is no rows. I'm going to create a variable here called max arrivals. And I'm gonna initialize this variable, so it's gonna be a real value, or I can change this to a string, but in this case it's gonna be a number, so it's gonna be a real data type. And if I wanted to have an array, I would specify the rows and columns here, but this is just a single number. And this is where I place my initial value, so double click here on initial values and replace this 0 with the number that we wanted to initialize, which is 999,999, and that's a very large number, so we're making sure that we got this. So alternatively, I could have double click here, and that gives me the way to model it through the dialog. So again, I can double click and introduce another variable, and this variable I can add it here in the spreadsheet. This is going to be my calls per arrival variable, and it's again a single number, so the data type is real, and I'm going to have the initial value here to be 1. So I'm going to change this default initial value of 0 to 1 and close it. And so now, right, I can see right here the new value is not default, it's the ones that I assigned. So again, if I wanted to, I could actually double click and edit it here, and then it adds initial values, just as I did create this through the spreadsheet. I can also populate this through the dialog. So now that I created these two variables, now I can use it in my create module. So create module is a flowchart module from the basic process panel. So I'm grabbing it here and placing my create somewhere here. So I'm going to go ahead and edit it. So I'm going to double click on it, or alternatively I could edit it right here, but I'm going to double click and edit it through the dialog. And here I'm going to type in the name create call arrivals, and my entity shouldn't be entity type. I want to call it incoming call, and the time between arrivals is going to be exponential, so I keep it as a default exponential, but I change the value here to 0.857, and my units are going to be minutes, and so the entities per arrival is going to be we can actually change this, right, to have the entities per arrival. Through the expression, we can find the variable current value and then calls per arrival. This is going to be our variable. And in terms of maximum arrivals, we don't want the infinite, we also want to change that. So I could build the expression, and again I could have typed it in, but it's much better if I actually build the expression, because there is much less, or there is no chance for me to make a typo. And so again, variables are in basic process, and then we have variable current value, and then here we have max arrivals. So you can see under the variable name, you scroll down, right, and from the scroll down list you have the selected max arrivals. So that gives us max arrivals. So now we're set here, and then the first creation is just 0. So we're all set here for our create. Now this created this create. And next thing I want to do is I want to be able to record the attempted calls. Because later we'll have different type of calls and we're going to change the types of it. We want to be able to record the calls. So I keep my create selected. So when I move the record and then the record here, it will automatically connect my record to my create. So I'm going to go ahead and add the record, and here I'm going to edit it. I'll double click on it, and then I type in record attempted calls. And it's going to be count. So record module is used to record the statistics, right? And so we're going to record this count, and it's going to be adding the count. So the value is going to be 1. So each entity that's going to pass through, it's going to add value 1 to the count. And then my counter name is going to be attempted calls. So I'm going to change this to counter name attempted calls. And if I wanted something more complicated, we could be using recording the set, but in this model it doesn't apply. So we're done here. We got this done, or I could also alternatively change this here, right, and the same way like I did was the dialogue, editing through the dialogue. I could have added it here through the spreadsheet. So the next thing I want to do is I want to decide whether the trunk line is available, because we only have 26 trunk lines. Every time the call arrives, the first thing that happens is there is a check of whether trunk lines are available, any of the 26 trunk lines. So I have my record selected, and here I'm grabbing the decide so that it will automatically connect my decide to the record. And here I'm going to decide whether, so I'm going to decide I don't need this word decide here. I can just type in trunk line available. And right now I'm just gonna leave it by chance, but we're gonna come back to it. Or actually, let me go ahead and talk about this different decide module. So let me go ahead and switch back to because this is where I'm gonna show you that we can also do the two-way by condition. And in the two-way by condition, we can use the expression here. And then in the two-way by condition, we can build an expression, because what we are trying to do is determine whether the trunk line is available. We need to decide by checking the condition whether the trunk line is available. So in this case, right, we would need to go in, right, and check the trunk lines, but we don't have the trunk lines yet. So I'm just gonna leave the expression as 1 here, and just remind myself that I'm gonna come back to this decide module. So if I left it like that, then it always would be true, because when I check this expression and value is 1, it's the same as true. So it reminds me I need to come back and change this. So in order to actually do that, I would need to introduce the trunk lines as a resource. So I could go here and introduce my resource called trunk line. And we're gonna have 26 capacity of this resource being 26, because we have altogether 26 trunk lines. So now that I did that, now I can go back to the decide module and change this expression here. So what I want to check is whether trunk line is available. And now that I have my resource, trunk line resource, I can actually do that. So I can build the expression. And before, I didn't have the resource here. I had entity, record, and variable, because those were the type of things that we already introduced in the model, and the resource wasn't there yet. So now I can select the resource, and I can look for the to build the expression. I need to know what is the current current number busy, whether the current number busy is smaller than the current number scheduled. So here, right, I'm gonna have less and then current number scheduled. So what it actually tells me, right, it tells me that if current number busy is less than current number scheduled, and the scheduled one is basically 26, right, I could have just put here 26, but then if I change the capacity of my resource, then I would need to go back in here and change it. But this current number schedule corresponds to the 26, which is the capacity there. So if there are some available, right, the scheduled are these many, and there is less, not all of them that are scheduled are busy, then we have a line available. So that's basically what this condition says. So now that we change this and introduce this condition, it will actually work a proper way, and we'll check whether there's any trunk lines that are available that we can assign to this call. So if that's true, then we can go ahead and model further what's going to happen. If not, then we're going to go ahead and record the number of rejected calls, because we're going to have to reject that call. So I'm going to add the record module, and I'm not going to select this. I'm going to just copy this one by pushing Ctrl+N buttons, and then I can paste it either by Ctrl+Shift or just pressing paste, and then paste it somewhere, let's say here. And so now again, right, because I copied it, the arena yells at me, and so I will need to change the name, but I also want to connect it, so I clicked here and then connected it from the false to the record. And now I'm going in, I'm going to change this attempted calls to rejected calls, because I'm actually want to count the rejected calls, but the rest remains the same. Well, not everything. I also need to change the counter name. So now I changed the counter name, which is important. So now we have record rejected calls. It's going to add value 1 to this counter rejected calls. If I left it as attempted calls, it wouldn't be correct, because it would be adding this 1 to this count, to the other counter, the attempted calls counter. So now that I changed it, I can actually dispose of the calls that are not going to be served. So I'm going to touch the dispose next after the record. I'm going to click here and rename my dispose into dispose rejected calls. And so let me now go ahead and review some of the information from the PowerPoint so that you know what we're going to do next. So what we also need to do is we need to go into entity data module, and since we did in the create, we already defined the entity type incoming calls, we need to select the initial picture for the incoming calls. So we're going to select as initial picture black ball. And as I mentioned, right, we also did all of this in terms of record, right? We're going to be recording the attempted calls and the rejected calls. So let me go ahead and change the picture in the arena. And here's my entity data module, and here are my initial pictures report. And so I want to change this picture report to the picture dot black ball. So here I don't really have the black ball, right? I could go in and change it. I'm just going to use the picture ball and save my model. And let's go back and review what's going to be the next thing. So some of what we already did. So after this, we have decide module to check whether trunk lines are available. And so I want to review what we did. Here it was a two-way by condition. So before we had two-way by chance, so it's a new type of decide modules that we introduced. And here we selected a logical expression where the NR was the number of units that resource has busy currently, and MR was the number of units that exist for that resource, right, or scheduled. And so it's again going to be the expression will evaluate whether it's false or true, right? When we had just the value of 1, it would by default evaluate the true. Now that we have this logical expression where we compare NR, whether NR is smaller than MR, it will be either false or true, and depending on that, right, we had some of the modeling. So if we have the false, we had the record added, and we had rejected call counter, and then dispose. But if we have the true, now what we're gonna do is we're gonna add this seize module, and we're gonna seize a unit of trunk line resource, and that will be released later. And resource data module for trunk line and other resources levels we already did add. And we also will be incrementing the variable total work in process. So we'll have to introduce this variable. We have to increment the variable for the number of active calls. And we're going to be using later this variable in the stopping rule because we need to know whether there's any more work in process that's happening, so we don't stop or terminate our simulation before we finish serving all active calls. We also will introduce a store module to animate the entity during the next delay module. And so this will need to be done because we're gonna split the seize delay release, right? We're not using the seize delay release, we're not using the process, now we are using the seize module, and so the seize is separated from delay and from release. And so in order for the entities to still be animated, we have to use a store, otherwise they would just disappear from the animation. So the store module is necessary to animate the entity, but with the store module we also need to use onStore module. And the store module adds storage animation separately, and it identifies with this logical storage by name. And in the storage data module, we need to have an entry made there by store module. And after the store, we have a delay module to listen to initial recording and make the selection. And we could have used the process module, but this is simpler and faster because it's more basic module. And then, as I mentioned, because we introduced store, we also need to, after the store, we always need to unstore. So we need to unstore module to make entity animation disappear. So let me go ahead and do all that and demonstrate how to do that in Arena. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add the seize. And as you can see, the seize is not found in the basic process. It is found in the advanced process. So the seize delay release can be all split up. We had it all together in the basic process as a process, but now an advanced process allows us to do it one by one, which that's what we need here because that's more complex and detailed model, which doesn't have seize delay release all happen together. They're kind of separated, so we need to keep them separated. So the next thing I'm going to do is select this decision module so that I can add the seize directly attached to it. So now I have my seize. I need to go in and do some editing. So I'm going to change this to seize trunk line. I'll keep the allocation as other and the same priority, and I need to add the resource so we know what resource we're going to be seizing. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to select from the drop down menu the trunk line. Each call only needs one trunk line, and so I could also add some resource state if I wanted to, but this is fine. And then this actually automatically creates this queue called ctrl-line-Q. And so the next thing I want to do is I want to increment the active call counter. So for that I will need an assign. So I need to count the active calls. So I'm gonna add the assign here, and in my assign I'm gonna change the variable. So I'm gonna change this, rename this as increment active calls, and then I'm gonna change this here by, I can either double click here on assignments, or I could just press add button. Either of these will work, right? So again, either I double click and this pops up, or I can press add and again the same thing pops up. So here, right, I would need to introduce variable, and I don't have the variable here, right? So I want to introduce the variable, and notice, right, we had two variables. I don't have the variable total work in process, but as soon as I say this and then say total work in process, and I'll go back and change it in a second, but if I go to basic process and look at variables, now I have the total work in process as a new variable. So what I want is I want to start by default, I want this to be starting with 0. So I'm not going to add any initial values, it's just going to be starting automatically from 0. Or if I wanted to, right, I could just change it to 0, it would still be the same. So either way it works one way or another. You can either leave it without initial value, or you can change initial value to 0, it still will work the same way. So, and what I want to do is I want this to be incremented. If I leave it as this, then it always will have the total work in process as 1. I don't want that, so I'm going to go ahead and edit it. I can either click edit, or I can double click on it. It works the same way. So I click edit, and then what I want to do is I want to, each time an entity goes through this module, I want the value of total work in process to be incremented by 1. And then after the entity leaves, then I will need to decrement it. So I'll have a similar assign where I'm decrementing it. So now that I have this new variable, I can use it here. So I go to variable, and that was under basic process variables, variable, and current value, and I scroll down, get this drop down menu, and then here I get the total work in process. And then I'm going to be incrementing it by 1 each time the entity goes through, which are incoming calls. And so now, this every time it goes through, the total work in process value will be changed, and what to the current value will add 1. So now that's correct, and I can go ahead and do the next thing, which means I need to be using store. So the store is found in advanced process. So in advanced process panel, there is a store module. So I'm going to add the store module right after my increment. And in the store module, I'm going to change the name to store for initial recording. And this is done so that the animation of the entity happens. And so I'll have the storage, and the storage name will be storage initial delay recording storage. Let's name it like that. And some type of course is storage, but there's other things that we could be using, and we might talk about it later, but not today. So the next thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna introduce a delay. So delay is also found in advanced process. So let me go ahead and add the delay. So here in the delay, we're gonna open it again and edit it through the dialog, And in delay, I'm gonna put another name. I'm gonna name it as initial recording delay. And again, allocation is going to be other. And remember, the time should be uniform with parameters 0.1, 0.6 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and build the expression here. And in the expression builder, I select random distributions. And then here I can select uniform. When I scroll down, I get the uniform distribution. And so I change my minimum value to 0.1 and my maximum value to 0.6, and it just builds my expression for me. So now I have the delay time, and all I need to do is just change my units to minutes. So again, important to remember about minutes. So now we're done with the initial recording delay, and we're ready to do the unstore, right? Because after the storing, right, this delay, we need to show the entity. So we introduce the store being animated, so we can see the entity being delayed. And after we finish delaying, we're gonna have to unstore it, so the entity disappears from the animation. So now again, if the store is in advanced process, the unstore is also in advanced process, and it's right after the store we have the unstore here. So I'm gonna go ahead and connect my unstore right to my delay module, and then I'm gonna double click on unstore, or I could have edited here, but I'm gonna double click on it, and it gets me into the dialog. And in dialog, I'm gonna edit this, and I'll rename my unstore to unstore from initial recording delay, which is going to be a default type, but there is other types that we could be using. And so after that, let me briefly review what we're going to do after this. But that takes care of the initial part of the call arrivals. So this is modeling the call arrivals, and the next we're going to be looking at different types of calls. So let me review what we're going to do there. So here, to decide of what we're gonna do, we're gonna have another decide module, so we can determine the call type, and it's gonna be a three-sided coin flip. So the type that we're gonna choose for the decide module is gonna be n-way by chance, and we're gonna be pressing the add button to add more sides of a coin, and we get new exit point for each add, plus an extra one for all the others or else. And you need to know that the probabilities are entered as percentages, so the values are between 0 and 100 and not between 0 and 1. If we enter it between 0 and 1, then it would then still calculate the other, right, or else, as from 100, so we would be subtracting something very small from 100, so that wouldn't be correct. So make sure you remember that the probabilities are entered as percentages. And the last entry is else, and we're going to direct call to one of tech support, sales, or order status areas. So in tech support calls, we're going to have an assign module, change entity type for separating out and results, change entity picture for animation. We're going to have store delay and store for recording and product type selection. And then we're going to have a decide module for product type. And again, it's going to be a different three-sided coin flip. So we'll direct the appropriate process module for that product type. So before I do the tech support calls, review the tech support calls, let me go ahead and implement what I reviewed. And now I'm going to implement it in Arena. So here, the first thing I want to do is I want to introduce another decide module. And who remembers what decide modules are? Very good, that's basic process. So I'm going to connect the decide module right after unstore. We're going to go to decide. And this is where I'm going to connect my decide. So maybe move it just a little more so I don't have the entity move through the modules here, right? So now I have my decide. I can either edit it here in the spreadsheet, or I could edit it in the through the dialog. So I'm gonna have to determine call types. So this is gonna be my new name for my decide module, is determine call type. And we used before the two-way by chance and two-way by condition. This is gonna be a new type of module where we have n-way by chance. So we select n-way by chance because we want a three-sided coin, and two-way by chance only that gives us two sides of a coin. So we're gonna add the percentages. You can either double click here, or as I mentioned on the slides, right, we can press add. So the first percentage, right, when I double click to add the percentages, and it reminds us, right, that we need to select the percentage. So percent true between 0 and 100. And you remember that the first type of calls are tag calls, and they're 76%, right, or 0.76 probability, or 76% of the calls are tag calls. And then after that, we also have to add another type of call, and that's gonna be our sales calls, and the sales calls are 16% of all incoming calls. So we're gonna put 16, and we don't need to add any more because there's automatically an else here. So when we generate these two, the remaining 100 minus 76 minus 16 will be the other type of calls, which is order status. And so we only enter the first two, and then the remaining one is going to be coming out of here as else. And that's exactly what you see, right? So now you don't see just a single one from here and then another one here. Here we still have another one as else, but now we have the double. As you can see here, there are two little triangles coming out. So now we can be attaching the sales calls. So as you recall, in the sales call, we first need to assign the tag call entity in the picture. And so we're gonna add the assign right after the decide. We're gonna add the assign. And I guess it connected it to the else, which is a good way to illustrate what's gonna happen, but that's not what I wanted. I want to first model my tag calls, so I'm going to disconnect it, and instead I'm going to press the connect button and connect it to the tag call, right, with this part 76% is going to the tag calls. And as you can see, there's a reminder for us that says 76 and 16, right? It reminds us that this one is 76, which corresponds to the tag calls. So here I'm going to put change this assign to assign tag call entity and picture. And then as this assign, right, I can either click the add button or I can double click. And here I need to have two assignments. First I need to change the entity type. And so here I can select different things. And the entity type is not a variable, it's an attribute. But we don't need to select the attribute here because there is already entity type attribute listed. So entity type and entity pictures are both attributes of entities, right? And attributes are local variables, right? They're very different from variables because variables are global variables in Arena, and attributes are specific things, right, characteristics of the entity. So entity type is among the attributes, and entity picture is among attributes for each entity. And there are additional attributes that we can define. So we're going to select the entity type. We're going to change the entity type, right? There's only right now only incoming call entity type. So what we want to change it is we want to assign it as a tag call, and that's what it's going to create. It's going to create additional row in this data module entity, and I'll show you so that you can see that. So let me go ahead and show you, and then come back and create the entity picture. So when I click on this entity, you can see that now I have the tag call, right? And that's my new entity type that was created when we edited this assign. So I'm going to go back to my assign, double click on it, because I also need to assign the picture. So I'm going to either click add, or I can just double click here and that adds another assignment. And so I select here entity type, and then what I want to for my sales call, I want to use a red ball. So instead of this report, I'm gonna go and find the red ball and use the red ball here for the sales calls. And so I'm done here, right? So I do this, and while I'm at it, I can also go ahead and do the similar things for the rest of the types, because for each of the types I'm gonna have this separate type assigned and also separate picture. So I'm gonna Control Ns, or I can just left click and then say copy, and then I can paste it right by either Control Shift or just pressing paste. And so I can, when I'm adding those, right, when I'm doing that right now, it's just gonna be screaming at me in yellow, right? So you can see at the bottom here we have 1 and 2. Now as I add it, right, it's gonna add another row, and it won't be happy with me having the same name, right, for 2 different modules, right, because the names must be unique. But I'm just gonna go ahead and do that anyways, because I know I will change it in a second, right? So let me go ahead and do that. So maybe also move the modules a little bit. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go back in here, and I know that my other calls, so the 16% of them are gonna be the sales calls. So I'm gonna go in and change this to the sales call. So I'm renaming this to sales call. Oops. Entity and picture. And more importantly, I'm also going to change the assignments, right? Because I need to edit this. So I can either click edit, or I can just double click and change my entity type from the tag call to the sales, because I want to track these entities as sales call entities. And I'm going to change the entity picture assignment as well. And my sales calls will be assigned a green ball. So green ball is higher up by alphabet, right? They're listed by alphabet. So I found this green ball here, so I selected. And so now I'm good on sales call. And when I do that, it's going to be fine with the sales call. But it's not going to be happy. So you see the sales calls are now whited out. Still not happy with this one being duplicate. So I need to go in and change this to order, to the order status. So I'm changing it to order status here, and also changing the entity picture by double clicking it and renaming this to order status. And then here I'm going to change my entity picture, and this is going to be a blue ball. So we have order status calls as blue balls. And so now, after I did all this renaming, now we're good, right? The arena doesn't remind me anymore in yellow that I need to do the changes. And while I'm at it, let me go ahead and connect it, the assigns to appropriate decide. So this is gonna be my sales calls, and this should go to assign order status. And so now I'm ready to go back to the dealing with the tag calls and modeling tag calls. But before I do that, let me demonstrate that now we have different number of entities. So remember, when we started, we had incoming calls, then we added the tag calls, we had 2 entity types. So what is your guess? How many entity types do we have now in the entity data module? Very good. Yes, we do have 4 now. So you can see here, right, in addition to incoming call and tech call, we now have sales call and our status call, and those appeared after we edited the corresponding assigned modules. So now let me go ahead and continue with the tech calls. So in the tech calls, the first thing I need to do is to model the delay. But the delay, right, is without any C's. We still want to animate the delay entity during the delay. So we need to go to Advanced Process and again introduce store and unstore. So I'm going to select the assign here. So my store module is automatically connected to my assign. And so now I have the store. Now let me go ahead and rename the store to store for tech call recording delay. And it's going to be type the same type storage, but of course there's other types that we could use. And my storage name is going to be the tech call recording delay storage. And then I will need to introduce the delay, so I'm gonna go ahead and use the delay module from Advanced Process because it's just quicker to edit it. And I'm gonna change this from delay 2, and I'll rename it as tech call recording delay. And still the same allocation other. And here I'm gonna edit the duration of the delay and change, before I forgot, change my units to minutes. So now what we're gonna do is we're also gonna change the delay time, and we can just type our delay in. We have uniform between 0.1 and 0.5, or we can build an expression to make sure that we don't make a typo. So I'll just select random distributions, and then I scroll down and find uniform, and here I change it to 0.1 and this one to 0.5, and this gives me an expression that now appears in the delay time. So now that I finished with the delay, the next thing to do is to unstore from the tech call recording delay. So I'm gonna go and find the unstore in the Advanced Process module. So I grab unstore and connect it to my delay, and then edit it to say unstore from tech call recording delay. And again, the type will remain default. And so the next thing I want to do is to determine which is the product type for this specific tech call. So to do that, I need another decide module. So I'm going to go ahead and add the decide module to decide on the product type. Actually, let me move it just a little lower. So the next thing I want to do is to have this decide module decide edited. So let me go ahead and review the decide. So on this slide is where I told you regarding the different product types. So we have 25, 34, and the rest, which is 41%. And then our recording for the selection time is the one that we just introduced. So we need to introduce 25 and 34, and the rest of this, or type 3, is going to be given as an else condition. So let me go ahead and do that. So now in Arena, I'm going to go in this decide, and I'll have 25. And I'm going to change it to the end way by chance because I have multiple, and I'll have 25, and then 34 for the product type 1 and the product 1, 2, and then the else is gonna be for the 41 is gonna be already automatically created. I also want to change my decide to rename it as determine product type. And so as you see, we have 3 different product types, 1, 2, and 3. And so the 2-way by chance wouldn't work here. So we need an n-way by chance because we have more than 2 different options. We have 3 options here, so we introduce 2. And then there's an else for the third one. And so here is our reminder that we have 25 and 34. This is 25 and this is 34. So we have the first type and the second type and also the third type. So here what I'm going to do is I'm also going to introduce the processes to do the process product type. So the processing of product types is going to be done through the process. So I'm going to go ahead and connect my first type process here. Maybe pull it just a little higher up. And then change it to the to rename it first as the process product type 1 tag call. And my action is going to be sys delay release because there's going to be some resources involved. And my resources for each of the different products, we have a different resource. So my first resource that I introduce is going to be tag 1, and for each call just a single tag. So we're going to have a tag 1, and I'm going to change this to the expression, and we'll introduce an expression. Here we don't have any expressions yet, but later we're going to change it to an expression, and I'll have minutes. And so I'll go ahead and come back to this in a second. So I want to have this as a tag time for my expression. And so expressions, right, variables, as you remember, are in the basic process, but expressions are in advanced process. So I'm going to click on the advanced process panel, and this is where I find my expression data module. And currently there is no expressions. So if I went in and I typed in expression there, right, it could appear, or I could just double click and edit it here, and I could double click and edit it through the dialog box, or I could edit it straight in here. So I'm going to change this to the tag time, and this is necessary because, as you remember, all different type of text, they all have the same expression, which is triangular distribution with parameters 3, 6, and 18. So I can enter it here as an expression, and I could edit it here by simply typing, or I could edit it through the dialog box, and then here I could either double click, or I could do edit. So the reason why I want to do this is because this allows me to build an expression. If I were to try, so okay, actually let's delete it for now. Well, let's just add it like this. If I were trying to do the expression here, and it doesn't allow me to select the build expression, there is no way to do that this way. So that's why I'm choosing to do it through the dialog. In this case, right, I can click the edit and then change this through build expression. So I left click and the build expression is there, and then I can select my expression, build my expression as a random distribution because it's a triangular. And so I'll scroll to triangular, right? So I selected, as you can see, random distributions, and then I scroll to triangular, And in triangular, I'm selecting parameters 3 as minimum, 6 as most likely, and 18 as maximum. So now that I do that, you can see right in my expression values, it changes to triangular 3, 6, 18. So that's exactly what we want, because we want to use this in this process. So let me maybe pull it just a little down so the Q is separated from this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually change the expression. So of course I could alternatively do this like this for each of them, but that just takes time. Plus, if I wanted to change it, I would need to go in each individual process and change it individually. So expression actually sometimes makes a lot of sense to use if you have it in many different, you're using it in many different modules, then you need to change it. You only change it in one module. So here I'm going to find my expression. So I could go to advanced process and expression, and then I get the value, and here's my expression time under the expression name. So I could alternatively type it in, but I could make a typo. So this guarantees by using the expression builder that I don't make a typo. So then I say OK, and I also want the similar modules for the rest of the product types. So I'm gonna just copy, right, either by Control Insert, or I can just left click and then press copy. So I did that, and then the next thing I do is I'm gonna press Shift Insert and have this added, and another Shift Insert and add this one. And again, right, because my names are not unique, I see that there's an errors in my model, but I'm okay with it because I'm gonna edit it in a second. And before I do some editing, let me go ahead and connect it appropriately. So this is gonna be my product type 2, and this is gonna be my product type 3. So I'm gonna go ahead and edit those. Double clicking on it, and I change it here to type 2 tag call. And of course, very importantly, I need to change the resources. So I'm going to edit here, and I need to change the resource name because there are separate kinds of resources for each product type. To handle each product type, we have different resources available. So I'm changing that. The text time remains as was. And then I do the same here. So now if I look at this, this is fine, but the 3 is still incorrect. So I need to change it to type 3. So now is unique, and I could have said OK, and that would be fine. However, right here, I also need to change the resource, because resource for type 3, we need a different resource, and it's going to be tag 3. So now that we added those resources, before we had a single resource. How many more resource rows do we have now under basic process and resource data module? Yes, you're right, we now have 4. So if you go back to basic process and check the resource data module, you can see additional, right? Before we only had the trunk line with a capacity 26. Now, just by editing these process modules, we added tag 1, tag 2, and tag 3. And so we also need to change their capacity accordingly. So I'm going to go ahead and change their capacity. So the tag 1 capacity should be based on the information in the model, right? In the model setup at the beginning, we have 2 tag 1 available. We have 3 tag 2, and also 3 tag 3s available. So we change the capacity there. So now we have all of these, right? And the next thing we want to do is, after they're done, right, we need to let them leave the system. But notice that at the beginning, when the calls were arriving, we see the trunk line. and we haven't released it yet. So if we just say dispose of these calls, then we wouldn't release the trunk lines, and then eventually after some time, without releasing them, they would be shown as busy even though they weren't really serving any calls. So it's important that now we add the release, and the release is found in advanced process. So for this Cs, we need the corresponding release. So now before we dispose of these tag calls that are done, being served, we need to also add the release. And because C is an advanced process module and panel, so we have a corresponding release module also in the advanced process panel. So here's the C's, here's the release. So we're going to add the release. So let's start with tag 1 calls and add the release there. And then let's also connect the rest of them to release as well. And what we're really doing here is we're not releasing the tag call people because they already been released here, right? You can see here we have cease delay release where the tags are released. What we're releasing in this release is we're releasing the trunk line resource, right? So we're gonna go in maybe actually I'll just move the release here maybe. So we're gonna have the release, and we rename this release trunk line, and we're gonna add the resource, and the resource that we want to release is, oops, not tag 3, I did it accidentally, trunk line. One single trunk line is released after each entity goes through this module. And then we also want to decrement active calls because we incremented, right, and increased the work in process. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it here. And as you see, right, again, I made a mistake because they're named the same way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to decrement, because the intent is to decrement now, so that we're releasing, right, that the work has been done and it's no longer work in process because we're about to discard, right, or dispose of these entities. We need to change this, right, and decrement the work in process by 1 each time an entity goes through. We're going to decrease the work in process because we're about to release this entity, or not release, dispose of the entity. And before we do that, we also need to record the completed calls, right, because these are the calls that are completed. So it's going to be similar to this one. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it here. And so again, right, I need to change this because right now it's not unique. But before I do that, I want to make sure I remember to connect this. So I'm going to click and connect these two. And so the next thing I want to change is I want to change the rejected calls to completed in both places. Here in the name of the module, so that it now will be unique. But even more importantly, here in the counter name, so we actually count the right kind, right? So the right count, the counter is being incremented by 1. So here I'm going to put completed calls, that's my counter name. And last but not least, I'm going to go to basic process, and now I'm ready to dispose of the completed call. So here's my dispose, and I rename it appropriately, dispose of call entity. And so now this completes the first part of model 501, and we're going to finish it in the second part.